Hey guys, so I'm going to be talking about the Master Blaster. So here's just some general positioning tips that I use. This is an incredibly rough layout of kind of how the room looks, specifically around the boss. So around the boss you'll notice that there are 4 squares, each of which have 4 smaller squares. We kind of use that as a coordinate system to show where we stand. So if you notice, the tanks kind of stand at the T's on the bottom, DPS stand at the X's. Now, this isn't an exact position, this is just kind of a rough layout. So let's see what happens in Phase 1 when the first knockback is planned. Now, the knockback is actually wider than the drawing here. We're going to have to move around a bit. So, the off tank is going to step right in order to allow the melee DPS to basically step where the tank on the other side would be. The healer that is in the back of the room is also going to move away from the knockback. And then what's going to happen in the early parts of Phase 1 is then the other tank will need to taunt as soon as the knockback happens, and you'll just do a mirror image of this. But let's add in some confusion. Specifically, let's add in some yellow circles. So these are the massive AoEs you can't stand in. So if you notice now, our DPS at the top, that is ledge side, is going to be in trouble if they stay there when the circles start to expand. Additionally, the other tank will need to be in position to pick up the boss as soon as the knockback happens. The knockback in this case will happen towards the left, or in this case what we like to call ship side. So we move as follows. The tank is going to move basically up into the middle. That way, as soon as the knockback happens, the other tank can taunt and move into position. The healer and the range DPS are going to have to move. Now, the range DPS has to be really aware in this fight that moves down from the top over to the right. Generally, this is kind of a basic layout of the movement, but there's a little bit more complexity. The general idea of our positioning is we have our 2 tanking points, we have a melee DPS that moves left and right, we have a tank who's the off tank in the middle whenever the patterns are up, the healer needs to move left and right away, and the DPS up at the top needs to be most aware of the positions because they need to move away from where the tank knockback is going, but also sometimes just left or right. So it's going to require a lot of coordination, but the advantage of this strategy is those 3 people up the top pretty much never have to move. It keeps their DPS uptime high, and the movement for most people is fairly simple. So now let's hop into the actual fight. This is from a tank perspective. This is my power tech tank. So you can see I'm standing right on that T, same as the diagram. That's kind of the magic spot where if you stand, you get knocked back to the ideal location, which is right there. Stand too far to the right, you'll die in the wall. Stand too far to the left, you'll get knocked over the side. So it's fairly precise. You can see early on we just swapped taunts. Now I'm going to do something that make power tech's tanks far and away the best tanks in this fight here. I'm just going to eat this knockback by popping hydraulic overrides. That lets me basically control the boss and watch for patterns. So you can see right there, as soon as I saw that orange circle behind me, I knew I had to swap because I'm taking the next knockback. You could just have the tank swap, but I like the consistency of having me always take the first knockback. So there you can see that our range DPS in the back can pretty much stand still because of the way the patterns are. Now I taunt as soon as the knockback happens, I move back in position. As soon as I see this cast bar, I'm looking behind me for where the patterns are. I can see, because of where that orange circle appeared, I have to move again. So we swap. You can see I move behind Gish, who's our melee DPS, and Gish just swaps to where I was before. I take the knockback, Deloth taunts. In this case, I want to run more to the center rather than back towards the boss because I want to make sure I don't get that knockback. We generally get 3 patterns. You can push the boss quickly if you do 2 patterns. However, if you cannot reliably get the boss down before he spawns the 3rd pattern, you're going to want to hold DPS at about 57%. We hold DPS here at 57% and tell them not to attack until right as the 2nd knockback is about to happen. The reason for this is the patterns do not go away when Phase 2 starts, and if you start Phase 2 with half the map covered up by these orange circles, bad things are going to happen. You can see now he just called the boss, so his shield's up. That's the end of Phase 1. Phase 1's really tough. You're going to need a lot of practice at it. Just work with your positioning and keep at it. Figure out what works for your team. Now, because of our comp, we don't need to do any tank swap in Phase 2. So I'm going to discuss the fight in that perspective, but keep in mind there might need to be a tank swap. Doloth here, in this case, is going to pick up Master, or we like to call it Small. The reason we say Small is then we call Master Big. That way you don't mishear a name, since Master and Blaster sound so similar. There you can see I continue to Hydraulics overrides. Generally, I can't get this second, but you can see I put my back to that orange circle. That's because the knockback comes every time after patterns change. Now, the healing in this phase is very difficult. It's very high requirement. As such, you are going to want to make sure that you have one healer always dumping heals into the big tank. The small tank's also going to take damage, but during fire spin, he should be able to avoid a very large amount of it. What we do is, since we have a heavy Sork comp, we have Sork step into that Ion Cutter beam and just Force Barrier. That lets them eat all 20 stacks. It does lower our DPS a bit, but all in all, it's not a huge concern since we completely negate damage, and we're able to beat the boss before the second Airstrike. Airstrike is actually a tough phase in hard mode. The reason Blaster is still pounding away at the tank who has aggro, that means healers need to be healing that guy. Additionally, you're going to have to be dealing with those grenade circles, so you want to make sure you're not crowding each other too much. Also, the patterns will change during Airstrike. After this third Airstrike, the people in front of me are going to have to get out. That's because a knockback comes very quickly after this Airstrike. Other than that, we just more or less rinse, wash, repeat in Phase 2. We use a Marauder to pick up some Ion Cutter stacks by popping Undying Rage when he's at 10 or 8 to 10 stacks. That way he'll absorb the rest of them with minimal damage. You can see that Doloth died there, but we're going to get him up. It's going to be alright. The idea is the phase ends when you push Master to 50%. However, you want to make sure that Blaster is no higher really than 25%. Blaster, you can push the phase with Blaster at 53% health if you want, but it's going to make Phase 3 impossible if his health is too high. I'll explain that when we get to it, which we're about to. So here, this should be the last Ion Cutter. We're now having all DPS just push Master as quick as we can. Before we get a second Airstrike, just because the Airstrike is pretty hard to heal through. It's, you know, big coordination check. But you can see we get that knockback, the pattern changes right there, and then we're going to start Phase 3. So in Phase 3, the goal is to push both bosses to 9%. However, you have to push Master to 9% before Blaster. That is, small before big. The downside is, you can see we cleave the raid there and everyone gets a debuff that magnetizes them to the deck. That's because this attack right here by Master that just went off, if you don't have that debuff, kills you. Knocks you off the deck and you die. The issue is if you kill Master too quickly, you won't have enough time to kill Blaster before he does his next charged attack and wipes the raid. Now, we do a tank swap at 30 stacks here. The small does stacks 10 at a time. You can see that Doloth died there, but I'm just running defensives, and I have both bosses for a second. I noticed that some people don't have the pulse, so I hit the raid again, then turn it back away. This is going to be, that was our last, I'm going to wait till we get the next cleave. I'm going to make sure everyone gets it, and then we're going to push Master. You have to push Master first, because if you push Blaster first, Master will heal him up to about 50%. At that point, it's a wipe, effectively. So now, Master has gone up at 9%, and we are in a straight-up, burn-down big before we die. You can see that we all had the stacking, or we all had the magnetized debuff there, which got cleansed by his pulse, so now we have until his next magnetized attack to get it off. And here comes the cast. We get it with 1 second left. This was a super tight clear that was not super pretty, but this is a hard fight. Phase 3 is probably the easiest part of the fight, but it's still by no means easy. Best of luck getting the fight down. Take care.